Hi, and welcome to Night Clerk Radio. This is episode 75, a look at noir jazz. And with me, as always, is my good friend and co-host, Burke. How are you doing?
I'm all right, Ross. How are you doing? Ready to get this episode going?
Yes. As the weather is getting colder, as spring has not quite sprung.
It's trying.
It's trying, and it's not quite able to get there. And so I feel as winter is giving its our last bit of cold, I figured this is a good time to talk about noir and what it has influenced. So by noir, I mean film noir, which, from the French term, black or dark film. If you're not familiar with the term, it refers to a whole genre of films from after World War II and are cynical, world weary, and mostly about crime or people living unhappy lives and desperately trying to get by. And it sort of reflects the disillusionment and discontentment people had after surviving World War II and realizing, the world is not what they were told when they were growing up. All of the layers of obfuscation and illusion had broken away from industrialized slaughter and just a long period of prolonged suffering. And now people had a lot of trauma to process, and that came out in part through film noir. Film noir is also linked to jazz and this music that is about, suffering, contemplation, and just reflecting on one's mistakes. And it was obviously very influential in popular culture. And it's had a resurgence, I think. It's sort of been rediscovered by newer generations, probably within the last 20 years, especially within the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's come and gone in waves.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing is noir now is kind of like a vibe, right? Like lo-fi or anything else. And I think a lot of the people into noir or noir jazz are like the aesthetics of it, because that's really what it is at this point. And of course, there's neo-noir and, film genres like that. But in terms of like fans of the music from noir or influenced or inspired by noir is people who are fans of video games, like in particular LA Noire, Fallout, the Fallout series, and BioShock, because all of those used older music and evoked the sort of tropes and aesthetics of film noir. And so if you go on, YouTube or Spotify now, you type in noir jazz, you'll pull up all kinds of playlists and mixes and whatnot of featuring this kind of like sad, hard-boiled music. But people are still making new music that is inspired by this. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at two albums that are clearly influenced by it. I mean, in one case, literally calling itself noir ambient. But do you think noir is making a comeback, Burke?
Yeah, it's weird. So just to respond to a bunch of stuff that you just said, noir is interesting because it's probably one of the biggest trope generators of the 20th century. Like the noir genre seeps its way into kind of everything, both in legitimate interest, especially like you were saying post-war. I think there's a little too much like economic depression for it to really come out after World War I. Yeah. But I do kind of associate those earliest 20th century wars with the rise of like existentialism and philosophy is kind of the same thing, where like, post World War I was Heidegger, and then post World War II, the French intellectual scene, for lack of a better word, really exploded with this sort of modern existentialism of like, Jesus Christ, everything got leveled.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what do we do? And I think that worked its way over to America too. I think also some like cultural exports from the war, like German expressionism, that low-key lighting, black and white stuff really comes in.
Yeah.
And then I think there were a series of legitimate like noir revivals. So you say neo-noir, which I think is like late 70s to mid 80s for me. So like, Blade Runner is like cyberpunk noir, early Lynch.
Oh, yeah.
Not like Eraserhead, but like Blue Velvet.
Yeah, for sure.
To the 80s. And then I think there's been a noir trend carried through by, say, filmmakers like the Coen brothers.
Yeah.
Right. Who have have in some sense worked noir, even into like comedy aspects, like Big Lebowski still has
Fargo,
Fargo. But yeah, they're more serious stuff like Blood Simple, Fargo.
There's also like, I don't know what you call, but I've heard neo-noir applied to movies like Blue Ruin and directed by Jeremy Saulnier. I think also just going back briefly, now that I think about it, a lot of the film noir is a reaction to like the Hays Code, right? Like pre Hays Code films could get very noir, like would, be on that same spectrum. And then after the Hays Code sort of fell out of use or, people stopped following it as much, let's bring back cynicism and dark shit.
Exactly. And then in terms of tropes, there was like in the early 90s, I feel like there's like a femme fatale revival because there's like Basic Instinct and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And all those like single white female, that time, which is not really noir, but still like
bound
women as villains,
I
guess is what I would say.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is like a early noir, like Mildred Pierce and Marion Dietrich and stuff like that is all classics of American film noir. But I don't know about now. So to your point of video games being a primary point of inspiration, I think it's true, but I also think video games are becoming just a point of are not like a separate class of media anymore. Like they're not like a niche market anymore.
Yeah.
It's sort of like also, to me, it's like saying people also just are inspired by movies. Like so many people consume them and they're so big. But yeah, so like LA Noir, like you mentioned and stuff. But I think the problem with a lot of this stuff, LA Noir is more directly, but just in general, like we always talk about Baudrillard, like we just took kind of all the tropes and just sort of reproduce them and then say it's noir, but like you don't have any of that cultural energy of the era.
No. That's true. Yeah.
So it just becomes this kind of detached set of tropes, which then I think get further reduced through this kind of like reductionist media machine of just take tropes, just put them out there into, like you're saying, of just like anything slightly dark, call noir, right? So like in music standpoint, another reason to think of this is like these YouTube channels that are huge because they do like noir covers of pop songs, which I know I've talked about. Yeah, like, I hate this Lady Gaga song unless it's played on a gramophone and then it's
or a torch singer
again.
doing it. Yeah.
And it's like it's all this. I don't know. It's all very weird to me.
No, it is. Like the algorithm on YouTube has just recommended me this stream or this channel called Jazz and Blues, very original thing. And all it is a bunch of live stream of like whiskey blues, relaxing whiskey blues compilation, relaxing whiskey blues music. Great. Yeah. And it's like, I guess it's just a looping playlist of music that's streamed. But like the thing is they have for the thumbnails is like a picture of John Wick in a suit, sitting in a chair. Or
I know what that is.
Yeah, exactly. Or the guy from Peaky Blinders or another Keanu Reeves or the guy. Yeah, it's just like, this is why I'm thinking of the video games, because it's the exact same kind of thing. I'm just like, aha, I know John Wick. I will, and I like blues because of video. Yeah, I don't know. It's entirely just a theory, but like,
and I get it. I think it's right. It's just like, it just points to video games just becoming, and this has been true for probably 20 years, that they're just a major media source. Like they just have to be included in when you talk about like media texts, like video games are just another thing you have to include. If just same you talk about literature or movies.
Well, I think it's just like I was referencing those three specific games because I think it really does come from those three specific things more than anything else.
Probably fair. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but it's a fine hypothesis.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, most of my noir stuff is either like seeing these movies as kids or seeing parodies of them. So some like early noir memories I actually have are like, there's a lot of noir stuff I feel like in The Simpsons.
Yeah. I think probably my first understanding of or education of the noir trope was Calvin and Hobbes.
I was going to say Tracer Bullet.
Yeah, Tracer Bullet. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Got 6 slugs in me, 2 are 45s and 4 are bourbon and like that type of pastiche. Yeah. Or like even fucking Family Matters had like a hard-boiled detective parody episode with Urkel and stuff. Like it was just a thing. Like it just became like, oh, look at this goofy old quaint thing. And then like any other set of tropes and genres, it just gets converted into like a brand identity and then resold as algorithmically produced soulless mixes of just, a fine selection of simulacra.
Yeah, exactly. So so this is all going on, but like clearly there's something in the air because like there's artists still making this kind of interesting music. And so with that, we should probably dive into the albums. That was from Merkin Hollow by Dead Melodies. This is track 5, Forbidden. So yeah, Merkin Hollow is a recent album from the Cryo Chamber, obviously a record label near and dear to our hearts. And I thought this was, obviously for me, like Miles to Midnight is still like probably the high watermark of the label for me in terms of album that I have listened to more than any other from them. But like, I feel like this is a worthy thing in the same like sub genre. I don't know. They call it noir ambient. Merkin Hollow is a album that comes with its own little story. They have a little 16-page PDF thing with the digital download. What actually happened that cold and misty November remained a mystery, but that cases were connected. That was clear. So this is an album from Dead Melodies, who I think we reviewed before, but
they were on the Cryo Chamber. They were on the Lovecraft compilations and stuff. They've come up, and then we've also covered them before.
Okay, yeah, and I quite like this album. I got it. It came out last November, and I just bought it because it sounded good. I've listened to it several times and so I wanted to review it for the show. So that is sort of the seed for this episode. Yeah.
It's a fine seed.
Yeah. So, I'd like to hear your thoughts before I go into it.
Sure. So I have an opening question for you that just popped into my head. Mm-hmm. So we recently released a Patreon bonus episode about visual mixes. Mm-hmm. And you said your interest in visual mixes is that you're always chasing the high you got seeing Queen Scotzi as a kid. Mm-hmm. Are you listening to Dark Ambient because you're always chasing the Miles to Midnight high? Because you mention it every time.
I think so. I think one of the cruelest things our own bodies, we're humans are pretty adaptive, right? Like we can get used to a lot of things and we can get used to bad things and that's how we get by. But like we get used to the good things too. Like we had this amazing experience and then like you build up a tolerance for it. And so it's never as good as the first time. And it's like,
that's right. You never get that pure heroin rush of Philip Glass.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know. I feel like this is I feel like it's in the same league. For some people, maybe this is even better than Miles to Midnight.
I mean, I'm with you. I really like Dead Melodies. I think they are probably, if I had to guess, I don't know for sure. I'm willing to be surprised, but I think they're probably responsible for some of the more interesting parts on like the Lovecraft compilations.
Oh, yeah.
Personally, that's a total bias.
Yeah.
It's not based on anything, but it wouldn't not surprise me because I do think they're interesting. So like, look, what do I think about it? We listen to a lot of Cryo Chamber and they're very good. I always say they're very good at what they do, right? Like the cinematic dark ambient that is amazingly well produced, really well put together, really interesting, very evocative, always does feel like it feels like score quality work all the time. Like it never feels lo-fi or cheap or anything. It always it's always well made. So yeah, these are albums I really like listening to. I love them as background music. I think they're a little fatiguing to review personally, just because I think that's I've talked about this on the Lovecraft compilation this year's, is they are kind of hard to like for me to listen to a lot. And like I probably need to stop trying to grind out like repeated listens.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a perfect example of what we were talking about in the intro of like this kind of detective story pastiche against like spooky occasional jazz. I would say the only thing as not a criticism of the album, but as it relates to the theme is I could have used more bits of like jazz music.
Yeah.
I think they're more like punctuation or accents like that live instrumentation.
Mm-hmm.
I would have liked to hear more of that because when it comes in, again, it's fairly interesting. But I do think like the textured aspects and the more ambient aspects of this were still fairly interesting.
Yeah. That's kind of when I got this album just to listen to. But as I listened, it's like, oh, this could actually be worth reviewing because I thought it stood out from a lot of Cryo Chamber albums for it's, like you mentioned, the live instrumentation. I think like there's a lot of guitar in this, which I really found interesting. Like the opening of the album starts with that, and it almost gets into kind of like a very slow post-rock, like / psychedelic rock kind of like when it gets really guitar heavy. Yeah. And so I thought like that was novel enough for a Cryo Chamber album that I was like, we could talk about this. So, and there's also some really great singing too.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Why don't we take a listen? And that was from track 7, Polaroid, which I think is perhaps my favorite track on the album because it starts with these, lovely chimes. There's the singing. It's very haunted, very good. And yeah, I think the album kind of starts out very slow. It does start with a more drony ambient stuff, but it kind of builds up and gets sort of at its peak around the middle of the album, tracks 5 through like 9, and then kind of sort of slowly goes back to sort of its ambient roots.
Yeah. I think my favorite track was probably track 2, All That's Left Behind. I just really liked the occasional piano and guitar. I think it felt the closest to being some sort of like meta soundtrack, which I think leads to my other real point I had about this album, thinking about it, is that there's like a weird meta uncanny valley for me with some Cryo Chamber stuff that I think is another thing that kind of, again, just on my end, because like the music's really good. It's kind of always marketed as this like cinematic dark ambient, right? So there's like this slight tinge of this is a soundtrack for a movie or like a season of True Detective that doesn't exist or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Which we often talk about in Vaporwave, like here's an album for a video game that doesn't exist or whatever. But because it's modern and it's doing new stuff, it doesn't feel as meta as Vaporwave. Like it's not pastiche or like reference to 90s video game soundtracks or something, right? So they're not doing like, a soundtrack to a noir movie that doesn't exist, but in the style of like what the soundtrack for like Mildred Pierce or something would be like, which I think is one of maybe the things that Miles to Midnight has going for it is it does have a little bit of, if I remember correctly, kind of like it feels more like dated in a good way. Like it feels more like classic jazz.
Yeah.
At parts. So I get this uncanny valley of like, I'm just listening to a soundtrack for something that was never made, but it doesn't have that enough of that like extra meta reference on it for me. Oh, okay. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's not the album's fault. It's like it's a weird thing I've noticed as a listener because I think, especially when listening to stuff for this podcast, I am often thinking about like the meta media aspects of this because that's easier for me to talk about than the music. I'm not a music critic.
Yeah.
Right. But I did go to school for a time for like media theory. So just in terms of what vocabulary I have, because as far as music goes, it's great. Yeah. Like I like listening to it. There's I think I would just go back to that. There's little bits of stuff that I just wish there was more of. Like track 5 has these little bits of horn that come in.
Mm-hmm.
Great structure. It'd be cool to have more of like an actual like soli of some sort, just like a saxophone arrangement or.
Yeah. It is a languid album. Like it is burning and slow. So like, again, I obviously we talked about this before, but ambient is a music that is meant to occupy the subconscious more than the conscious mind.
Exactly.
So yeah, overthinking it. I don't know what you're talking about.
That's what I'm saying. It's entirely like a listener issue, not an album issue. I think it's a fantastic example of their cinematic dark ambient.
Yeah, I just thought it was noteworthy enough for me to like this should go on the show because they put out a lot of great stuff, but like a lot of it's very consistent.
And Crowd Chamber puts out so much that I think when something does stand out, that it is. I agree that it's worth mentioning because there can be signal to noise issues when they when you produce so much.
Mm-hmm. We should move on.
Yeah, we got more cases to study. That was from the track Jack Paints It Red, which is track 6 off our second album, Thought Gang by Thought Gang. Now, Thought Gang is something I stumbled across because full behind the scenes caveat, I thought we were doing more architectural horror. Mm-hmm. And Ross was like, no, we're doing more noir jazz. I was like, fuck. And I was looking at it and I was like, oh, this came out. I saw this project, which is a esoteric experimental jazz album by David Lynch and Angelo Badalamenti, who unfortunately passed away December of last year, 2022, which also coincided with Lynch stopping his like weather reports and stuff on YouTube. So I hope he's doing okay. Now, what is this album? This is a side project started by David Lynch and Angelo Badalamenti, who's like his longtime composer, did like Twin Peaks and Blue Velvet and basically all the music for all of his projects, almost. And they just started working on it around the time they were doing the second season of Twin Peaks and Firewalk with me. So like 91 to 93. And it was a thing that they just kind of continued to chip away at, little bits and pieces of stuff on this album and other things they worked on appeared in Lynch's work throughout that time period. Both those projects, Twin Peaks: The Return, like Lost Highway, some other stuff he was working on. And then finally in 2018, it was released proper. And that's what we have today. And boy, it is a very different album than Merc and Hollow.
Yeah, boy, it is. The other side of noir, like noir films always have the scene where the character's in a frenzy, ready, murdering his best friend who's betrayed him, or the femme fatale, or, all three, or, it does have ambient sort of moments in it, but it is a wildly eclectic album, which reflects like the fact it was made over a long period of time, right? With a variety of collaborators. Like they brought in musicians for different songs, and they made them over, while they're working on Twin Peaks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of the stuff does appear, like little stings and bits and pieces of this I did recognize from showing up in that, or like references to that media.
Yeah. Like the track that you sampled, I know is like, oh, these people are insane, aren't they? Like, they like it is. There's several tracks on this album that are just an outright like a sonic assault on you. Like they're just like
100%.
Yeah, they just go after your senses, like your ears. It is a lot. And then they just immediately in the next track just immediately shifted like a dreamy, like ambient, summertime at night kind of like vibe. And it's, you never know what to get. And which is like, from those two. Yeah. That fits. That fits a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. So the album is really in three parts to me, split up with like a dividing sort of track that is different from what was before it. So like the first two tracks are, the first track is a lot of like chaotic hi-hat and horns, and then like kind of moody and distorted, kind of get you going. But track two is then this like, I called it satirically upbeat jazz. And this is a thing that appears a lot in Lynch's media, where when there's like humor or a slapstick or like confusion occurring, but not serious, like dramatic confusion, like comedic confusion amongst characters, he almost always plays this like slapsticky upbeat jazz.
Okay. Yeah.
So I imagine that came out of production work, but maybe they added a little onto it. But there's also like Wookiee noises and shit, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. Like it's
weird.
Very weird. It's all over the place. It's beautiful. But then it cuts to track three, which is like not jazzy at all. It's like a little funky with the bass, but it's very like straight up driving rock and like a little bit of like 808 pings, like that ping, ping, ping. That's like, that's an 808 sample.
Nice.
But then, so that's your part one, right? And that track that's very different is your interlude. And then the next few tracks are this blend of groovy, fast tempo, lo-fi, chaotic, but tend to have vocals. Like there's a lot of rants, a lot of spoken word through this part, but against like fairly aggressive percussion and like ominous vocals. And it's, or there's some parts like, track 5 has like upright bass and cello, more strings out of nowhere. But then there's track 8, which is your second interlude track, which is a prelude to a later track, Frank 2000. And that's like you said, like this little like gentle summer interlude, right? So it transitions you from part 2. And then the back third, the last 3 tracks, I almost called like proto cryo chamber, which is why it's somewhat related to what we're doing today.
Oh, sure.
Which is all of a sudden it becomes these great vocal samples, this like deep rumbly bass. There's across all these tracks, there's like all this frequency sweeping texture stuff, deep aggressive bass that I bet sounds amazing on like a proper sound system. Yeah. And it's all punctuated by this like chaotic in and out of real instruments. And then by the time you get to the last, the last album, it's really just like the facade of it being like a jazz album just completely dissolves. And it's just like static nature samples, bits of percussion. The last minute and a half are like outright noise. Yeah. Like just like structureless noise ambient. And I don't know. I think it's all that like weird dream logic. You don't know where you're going next type vibe of most of Lynch's media, which I think is why overall, despite being so aggressive, I think this is like a fascinating listen. Like, I don't think this is something you put on at a party. No, but I think it's something that like is worth experiencing, like headphones, like sit quietly with headphones and listen to it. It's not you don't want to put it on the background.
Have them turned down a little bit. Like it gets
protect your ears.
There's a bit wide dynamic range in this album. We'll just say there's the vocals, like especially in like the midsection. I was at parts. I was like, am I in my Godspeed You Black Emperor album? Like, where how did I get here? What is going on? Just some really grade A ranting in there.
Yep. Yeah. So if you don't mind, I'm actually going to play a sample from one of these later tracks, just Frank 2000. So this is track 11. I think it's the big masterpiece or what the album is really building up to because it's 16 minutes long.
It does get into like a full jam session, but it starts out as this cryo chamber thing. It's really cool.
Yeah, I think Godspeed or like any sort of the more textured aspects of post-rock are also like a good touchstone, like a reference point for a lot of this stuff. I think for me, I sort of described it as drifting in and out of the chaotic and the familiar.
Okay.
Right? Like in and out of a nightmare. Like a nightmare, unless you're having a really bad one, is very rarely 100% tear, at least for me. Like it kind of comes and goes.
Yeah.
And I think you sort of drift in and out. And there's almost, if I can pull a patent term, there's almost like this comfort anxiety between like, oh, this is some nice little jazz. I'm in my jazz cafe. And then it's just like,
yeah.
And it's like, oh, Jesus Christ. And Angelo Badalamenti's yelling rants at me. What is happening?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like I put in my notes for like track 1, this is pure acoustic anxiety. Like this is, it just starts out like that. And I think 100% you are right about this, because like this is like David Lynch's MO is just to pull the rug from you. Like it's comforting. It's nice. Oh, it's this great suburban neighborhood and everyone's happy and the white picket fences, and there's a human here. Like it's just
exactly.
Like there's chaos underneath the facade, and this is this in music
your
form.
Idyllic northwestern town that's actually a front for prostitution and drug running, and there's also like a weird evil meta temple under it.
Yeah. No,
in some sense.
Yeah, no. So this is just a further exploration of these themes. And so if you like, noir, because like there was sort of like in the original film noir, even like a sort of dreamlike logic to a lot of those films. It was a lot of style over substance sometimes.
Yeah.
And this album is great. It is just it can be, I was not expecting that when I started listening to it. I just like, Thought Gang. I didn't even realize it was David Lynch and Angela B at first, Badalamenti. And then it's like, oh shit, who's doing, I was like, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It all clicks. Well, and it fits in nice with the noir because, to add on to your point, those noir films are, and preceding dramas into the 50s, like Tennessee Williams stuff, are like huge touchstones for Lynch himself. I mentioned Blue Velvet being example neo-noir, like Lost Highway, really a lot of stuff. Twin Peaks has a lot of, like Twin Peaks almost takes, in addition to the soap opera stuff of the time, also plays with a lot of tropes of like hard-boiled detective with Cooper, which he's not really, he's very carefree, happy-go-lucky,
right,
in some sense, but more serious rather than like downtrodden. And he's kind of forced to deal with how weird this town is and stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
before you even get to like his arc in The Return.
Yeah,
but I do think a lot of these noir tropes, in a meaningful sense, carry forward into a lot of Lynch's work.
Yeah, no, it really does. And again, I think it's like artists are like, I mean, obviously there's a lot of lazy stuff, just taking the tropes and running with them. But then there are artists who are taking these tropes and building on them and creating something new and interesting. And like, this is a great example. I really like that they use synths in this. Like it adds a nice touch to it. And like something, I think if film noir people in the 40s and 50s had access to synths, they would have thrown them in there. Because, a lot of those movies were low budget and they, oh shit, cheaper music. Yeah, let's use that. Because that's how they were used in the 80s. So yeah, I think this is a really unique album and definitely worth listening to, but it in some ways it's the polar opposite. It's interesting that like the noir and like that sort of like shared genre can create such wildly different albums too. But also, I don't know, it's fascinating.
There's a lot of different ways anxiety can manifest, right? Yeah. Which is largely the root of a lot of noir. Yeah. So yeah, 2 very different albums, but 2 excellent albums and both worth checking out.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Be sure to check out both those albums. They're both rewarding listens. And our next episode will be continuing a tide of darkness in some ways. As we mentioned video games, so we're going to be looking at actually listening to some video game soundtracks, Signalis and Dark Tide. And we'll be having a special guest, Caleb, coming back to talk about both these albums. And I think that'll be a lot of fun. And if you like this podcast and you want to help us keep making this podcast, please check out our Patreon, patreon.com/nightclerkradio. We'll have a link in the show notes. And we get bonus episodes to our patrons. Our latest episode was about visual mixes, visual albums, visual playlists. What are those? What are some great examples? How does it relate to Vaporwave? And be sure to check that out. And we are on Twitter at Night Clerk Radio. I am at Ross Payton. Burke is at Burke McBurkinson. We have a website, nightclerkradio.com, where you can find all our episodes, except the bonus episodes, which again are on Patreon. And we have a Facebook page. And if you like this podcast, be sure to check us out or rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever you listen to podcasts on. Tell your friends, tell your femme fatales, tell your best friends who betray you for money.
Oh my God.
Anyway, thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.